Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame wherever we can, especially sexual shame. And today I am super excited to have both of the authors of this amazing book called Desire. We've got Dr. Lauren. I'm going to try to really say this correctly. Dr. Lauren Fogel Mersy. If you can wave so we know who you are. There you are. And Dr. Jennifer Vencill. Yes? Okay. And these two lovely people met at the University of Minnesota Medical School's Institute for Sexual and Gender Health, where they both completed postdoctoral training and there had a discussion about how a book like this was necessary, which I totally agree with, about desire discrepancies. And I would love to have you both take a little bit more time to introduce yourselves personally, what brings you to the field, and what in particular made you super interested to write about this topic. So who'd like to go first?
I can start us off. I'm Lauren Fogel Mersy. I'm a licensed psychologist in Minnesota. I'm also a certified sex therapist and a certified emotionally focused couples therapist. So sexual health and relationships is the work that I do. I own a private practice virtually that I've been doing for several years. My passion is working with partners and individuals to help them have better relational and sexual experiences. And there's just a whole gamut of things that we talk about and work on together. And, one of the things that comes up a lot is around sexual desire. And so there was a need to, explore that a little bit more. And Jen and I decided to put the thoughts that we have in writing and work on kind of trying to bring some of our message and our work out into non-therapeutic spaces so that more people had access to the information.
Okay, wonderful. How about you, Dr. Vencill?
I'm Jennifer Vencill, she, her pronouns. I'm also a licensed psychologist, ASEC certified sex therapist, and I'm board certified in clinical health psychology. So I spend most of my time doing integrated sexual health care at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Though I will say I do not speak for Mayo Clinic. I speak for myself today as we're talking. So what that means is I'm working with patients that have sexual health concerns in the midst of other medical concerns. So that might be menopause, that might be diabetes, that might be heart health issues. I work with a lot of prostate cancer, breast cancer, gynecological cancer survivors, for example, who might be having sexual health concerns. I also have a particular passion in helping folks that are kind of moving out of high control religious environments or backgrounds and kind of looking at sexual health through that lens as well. So very disparate kind of interests in the sexual health care that I provide. I'm also a researcher and academic. My passion within that world has really been looking at LGBTQ plus sexual health concerns and how we can help really maximize sexual health for the queer and trans population who are often neglected when we have these conversations.
Yeah, right. Well, and I thought you did a really great job of making the book really inclusive for all the different kinds of folks out there. And so right off the bat, I think, I'm going to read some of the questions or comments that I think are very typical that come into our practices. And I think a lot of the listeners might, maybe resonate with one or a few of these, but it's like, I want to be sexual with my partner or spouse or lover, but sex doesn't really cross my mind. I want to want it. I hear that all the time. In fact, I've had a few people tell me I want to want it. So just kind of adding a few more ones.
Several layers.
I used to want sex all the time, but lately I don't. What's that about? My partner is super attractive and I love being sexual with them, but they reject my advances. I'm not sure what to do about that. If I never had sex again, I could care less, but boy, my partner sure seems to care about it. So what am I supposed to do for that? Maybe my body has changed. I don't feel attractive anymore. So what I used to find sexy and attractive, I'm just not in the mood. So these are the kinds of comments. And I typically tell people, because I think wasn't it Emily Nagoski who, when she did her research, she's like, oh, everybody thinks they're broken, right? Everybody thinks they're broken. And so I try to normalize that desire discrepancies are one of the most common things we see as sex therapists, and that this is pretty normal. So yeah, why don't I get your thoughts a little bit about kind of what you've seen, and is this kind of what brings you to this topic, is all the complaints and sadness that you hear in your clients?
Absolutely. I mean, we know that for most sex therapists, this is the number one concern that brings partners, even individuals, into their offices, right? Some sort of desire discrepancy or differences around desire, whether that's level of libido. I think something that's important for us to talk about today are the two different types of sexual desire or libido, because that often is underlying part of what the concerns might be too.
Anything you want to say about that, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I think we like to send the message and impart how not just normal this is, but it's to be expected at least at some point in a partnership or across a lifespan. So not only is it normal, but it may even be the norm rather than the exception, that, either just for a brief period of time or more perpetually, you and a partner or partners will have some differences, both in the general relationship and then, of course, within the sexual realm as well. And so, beyond just normalizing it, that it happens. It happens a lot, to the extent that, like, we should be maybe learning about this more, talking about this more, and expecting this to be part of being in relationship.
Yeah, and you start off the book, I thought, with some really good, just basic sexual health principles. So like, if we're going to function from this place of understanding, do you want to cover what you feel those basic, we need to all be on the same page, that this is kind of where we're beginning before we have the bigger conversation?
Yeah, I mean, the first one that you'll recall from the book is that consent is key, right? So oftentimes when we're helping partners work through desire differences or concerns around this topic, consent is the foundation, right? That means enthusiastic consent, not just well, I feel like I should do this because I'm feeling guilty, or I know that this is what my partner wants. That is not enthusiastic consent.
Any other principles you want to cover, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I think we approach things in a way that sort of says, hey, there's nothing inherently wrong with you, and there's room for you to have a lot of individual difference when it comes to your sexuality. So we're really careful in our writing and in our work to not come to the table with a preconceived notion of what you should be doing, and that everybody's supposed to be doing the same sort of things. So we talk about things like compulsory sexuality, we talk about asexuality, we talk about the spectrum of sexuality, and the fact that there is room for everybody to have, sort of their own way of being sexual and to be different. And one of the primary messages that we have in our work is that we're not trying to make people match or the same as their partners or everybody else that they think they should be like, and to really maybe find more of what speaks to them, to you, and to find some authenticity within your, sexuality, so that we're not just trying to make everything look the same just because that's supposed to be how we do it.
Yeah, right. Well, and I really appreciate too that you started off with this idea that I think for some people is still maybe a little foreign, but that our pleasure is our own responsibility, that our partners are not responsible for our pleasure. And especially since I come from high demand religion and conservative communities, it seems like that's the message we got a lot of times, especially if you're residing in a female body. It's kind of like, well, your pleasure is going to be awakened, and in kind of this heteronormative script that many of us grew up with as well, that if you're a woman, your sexuality is going to be awakened by a man when you get married, and later on. And even things like masturbation or solo sex or self-exploration are kind of not necessarily supported as part of healthy sexual development. So that can be really a foreign idea that we are responsible for our own pleasure. So what are you finding about that?
I appreciate that you say that so much, Natasha, because there's such a gendered message. Whether you're coming from a faith-based background or even a more secular background, there is such a gendered message about who pleasure is for and who gets to access pleasure in general, but specific to sexual experiences as well. And that message tends to be that women are responsible for men's pleasure, right? And so we mean this when we say this in the book, that you're responsible for your own pleasure, regardless of gender, regardless of type of body that you're in, right? But I think it's important to really highlight that there are very gendered cultural messages here at play.
Yeah, which can then, of course, interfere with desire if you're trying to fit, like you're saying, a cultural norm or an expectation versus coming at desire from a place of like, what do I actually really want? What do I enjoy? What do I find useful and pleasurable? So yeah, let's start maybe with the two of you helping us understand just some terms. Like, there's definitely like a difference between desire and how we might think of the word arousal. Can you start there? And then you mentioned earlier that you're going to talk about two types of desire, so we can move right into that.
Sure. And one leads to the other. So I think that's a perfect segue. So when we talk about arousal in this book and generally kind of in the field of sexual health and sexual medicine, we're referring to kind of the physical arousal, the physical signs of sexual excitement. So this might be genital tingling, lubrication for some, erections, perhaps, your heart rate going a little bit faster, maybe you're sweating a little bit, kind of those physical signs that, oh, we're kind of getting into things or we're interested in things, right? So arousal tends to be more that physiological aspect. Versus desire, which we think of as psychological. Desire is that wanting, right? The wanting to want, that interest in sex. An older term for this is libido. People might still use that. So libido, desire, sexual interest all mean the same thing. It's more of that psychological kind of mental arousal, if you will.
Yeah, great. Lauren, are you able to kind of talk us a little bit through the two different types of desire as we currently understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. So within that, there is the idea of spontaneous desire, which is something that most of us are familiar with. It's what gets depicted in the media most often. And it's the sense that desire just emerges sort of on its own, maybe quickly, maybe without much buildup, and that it's not something that you have to necessarily work to cultivate or put a lot of time into. And certainly that's the message that we've all been taught. And for many of us, that's the only type of desire we've ever known or seen represented. And it does work that way for a lot of people. It feels that way. It's experienced that way. And that's a totally valid pathway to experiencing desire. But what we also know is that that's not the only pathway to experiencing desire. And about 25 years ago, Rosemary Bassan's work talked about this sort of nonlinear pathway to desire and came up with this term responsive desire, which reflects desire that often can emerge in response to either arousal or stimulation or pleasure. And so it may come after something physiological gets awakened. It may come after connection. It may come after some sort of other stimulus. For some people, it can feel like it takes a little bit of time to build. For others, it may not take much time, but it may take some sort of other stimulus to cultivate it. And so that's also an equally valid and common way to experience desire. It's just one that maybe doesn't get talked about enough, isn't as well known and represented in the media. And it's often the style that is more predominant in the folks who come to see us who feel like something's wrong with their libido because they're not experiencing spontaneous desire more predominantly.
Right. And so this gets us, like, I'm already thinking, which question am I going to ask you out of the 5 different questions I have? I think that this is complicated for folks. I work with a lot of folks who are, for example, going through a faith or religious transition, right? So they're going from a system where they feel like they did a lot of work trying to fit in to the standards and expectations of their culture, their family, their religious leaders, whatever it is. And now they're on this journey to really find themselves and to be authentic, personally authentic. And so I'm getting a lot of people coming in saying something along the lines of what you just said, Lauren, right? Like either I'm broken because I don't have spontaneous desire, or why should I have spontaneous desire? In fact, I don't want to have sex and I don't owe my partner sex. And I've been doing sex for my partner or for my community or for everybody. And now I shouldn't have to feel this pressure to want it or to have it. And so I see this pendulum shift. And I guess where I'm going with this is you talked about a willingness model, which I think Joanne Lulin came up with. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can understand responsive desire, spontaneous desire, and also this willingness model to still stay authentic to who we are, and yet also still be relational, and how this fits. So I feel like this is a convoluted question I'm asking you. But
We got you. We got you.
it's all these things that I'm like, wow, yeah, a lot of people are really wondering, like, how do we show up authentic?
Yeah.
And how do we, talk about these things and get what hopefully, if you're in a partnership, what both of us would like to have happen.
Yeah. So I'll tackle this one, and Lauren, you can add in as you see fit. The kind of classic thing that I tend to hear from partners who are more responsive in their style or their type of libido is that once we get started, it's a good experience, right? If it's not a good experience, that's sort of a different conversation and a different set of concerns, right? But a lot of times folks are coming in saying, I'm not having that spontaneous libido. I'm not having like the arousal and the desire at the same time, which is kind of classic spontaneous libido, that wanting, right? And that's what I'm looking for. But once we get going, once my body gets warmed up, I have that arousal, then my desire responds, right? Hence the term responsive desire. And from there, it's all good. And I sort of wonder to myself, why don't we do this more often? Or I look to my partner and we kind of laugh and say, why don't we do this more often, right? It's pleasurable, it's enjoyable. So that's sort of one set of concerns. The other is that if responsive desire is also disrupted, right? So if you've been taught that pleasure is not something for you, right? And so you don't have either spontaneous desire or responsive desire because the sexual experience is not a good one, that's sort of a different conversation. And so I want to kind of parse that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. So responsive desire, meaning that once you put yourself in a situation, you respond well, right? Versus
And the willingness model is really more specific to that situation, right? So we don't want people trying to sort of consider whether they have willingness to have sex if the sex that they're getting ready to have is going to be painful, negative, traumatizing, right? The willingness model does not apply in those circumstances, I would argue, right? This is if we know that responsive desire is consistent, it's fairly easy once we get the body going, right? And so the willingness model was first developed by Joanne Lulin in the, 80s now, I believe. And she really talked about, without using the language responsive desire, this concept of, okay, I know I'm not having the spontaneous urge or lightning bolt moment of horniness right now, but I know that if we get started, if I have some touching that feels good, if we have some pleasure, I know that I can get there, right? And so the willingness model, especially as we talk about it in our book together, really is sort of capitalizing on that, knowing that the response is going to happen. What do we need to do to set up the circumstance to get there, right? Are you even willing to do that? And sometimes you might not be, and that's okay. So Lauren and I, in our book, we talk about using a 0 to 10 scale, right? Because willingness is not a black or white. It's not a yes or no answer. So we talk about, think about this on a scale. You can use this as a self-assessment. You can also use this to communicate with your partner, right? So 0 on the willingness scale being, I'm not having spontaneous desire and I'm not really willing to try to have responsive desire right now either. Like things are crazy, it's hectic, like, I've got a headache, whatever the reason, right? The other side of the willingness scale, right? A 9 or a 10 being, I'm not feeling spontaneously horny in this moment, but I do know that we have time, I have the energy, right? I know if we get going, I can cultivate that responsive libido. I can cultivate that responsive desire. And so, yeah, I'm willing to try. Most people don't find themselves so easily at a 0 or a 10, right? They're landing somewhere around a 4 or a 3, right? Or a 7, right? And so what we talk about in the book is strategies for kind of considering what are the accelerators, what are the brakes, what are the things that move you back and forth along the willingness scale. So if you're not having spontaneous libido, that's okay. If you're not having, responsive desire in that moment, but you're not really willing to get there, that's also okay. But if you are thinking, yeah, I'm sitting here at maybe a 3 on the scale and I'd like to be at a 9 or a 10, what are the things that need to happen, right? What are the things that need to move you further up the scale? Is that something that your partner can assist with? Is it like getting the kids in bed? Is it getting all the stuff for tomorrow? Like, what are the things that help move us more into that willingness kind of area of the scale? that can again be both kind of a communication strategy between partners, but also a self-assessment too of, okay, right now I just got home from work and I'm stressed. I'm sitting at a 4, but if I can get XYZ done and we can get to bed at a certain time, I know that I'm willing to engage and that I can get that responsive desire going, even if right now I am definitely not having spontaneous desire.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it is really important to think about the motivation and the intent and what it is that you're working towards. Because the reality is that there are people that I think are trying to negotiate sexuality in not the best or healthiest relationships, right? Where we might think of some domestic violence issues or power and control wheels type stuff. And so I'm glad that you're kind of reminding the listeners on a regular basis it's not who we're really addressing a lot of these comments to.
Right. When we talk about willingness, we're also, it's not something that can be coerced from you. Like it's not an external thing that you create. It's something that comes from within. So we're very careful with that language to really support people in understanding that this is about sort of a self-assessment and a like learning sort of what works best for you and what creates openness to experience. It's not something that you pressure a partner into or ask of a partner. It's an experience on your own, and that's really important too, because otherwise, then it's not willingness. It's just pressure or coercion.
Right, exactly. And that's tricky, right? I mean, I hear lots of people coming in talking about like, okay, if I say no, then I feel like I'm going to be, dealing with poutiness or with the silent treatment or with, grumpiness on the other side. The other side, if you've got maybe the higher libido partner or the initiator, they might have what I've called initiation fatigue. It's like, well, but I'm the only one, that is now, pursuing and initiating. And so they can get caught in these patterns. And you talk about, like pursual withdrawal patterns, right? That couples typically fall into, and they create stories around these patterns. Like, well, it must mean that you don't find me attractive, or that you don't desire me, or that sex isn't as important to you as it is to me, right? So lots of meanings and stories that people kind of come up with to explain these desire discrepancies. Do you want to address some of that?
These are essentially what we call sexual cycles or negative cycles that can develop. And there are trends to this dynamic that we see over and over again, right? And each partner within this dynamic can have their own sort of dilemma. Like you were just saying, Natasha, that, the partner who's, quote unquote, lower desire can feel pressure and I don't want to disappoint, so I need to show up. But if I show up and I'm not really into it, I'm not wanting it, I'm not enjoying myself, I'm creating some negative association to the sexual experience, which is disincentivizing me from wanting to pursue this in the future. Because now sex is really just a service that I provide to my partner, but I'm losing my own motivator that is just for me, right? So, but then if I say no, then like you said, there might be pouting or hurt feelings or conflict. And so now I have a dilemma. Do I show up and have sexual experiences that I'm really not having a positive association with, that's not building it's not doing anything for my desire that's helpful? Or do I, risk disappointing or hurting my partner's feelings or having conflict? That's a terrible dilemma for a lot of folks to be in. And then the flip side to that, right? The higher, quote unquote, higher desire partner also has a dilemma. If I don't say anything about my desire, my need to connect with you, I might feel really disconnected. I might withdraw. I might be hurting and feeling alone because I'm not able to talk to you about this. But if I do talk to you about this, maybe it lands as pressure, or you feel like you should or you have to. And I don't want that. So often there's this dilemma for both. And what we do in a lot of the work in couples, relational therapy, sex therapy, is try to address some of the dynamic that evolves within this dilemma. And the goal is not to match up everybody and say, okay, we all have to have the same sexual desires and frequencies and ideals and all of this. But how do we break this cycle? because this cycle is harmful for all partners involved. And that's a really nuanced, expansive, kind of conversation that we have with people who, get stuck in these cycles together.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, you're right. I think people get stuck in those cycles either because they come with certain scripts. You talk in the book about cultural scripts and family scripts and media scripts. And I think there was three things you all said, like shoulds and oughtas and musts. It's like we should on ourselves, we should on our partners. And so we have a lot of expectation, and that gets really, boy, that's the anti pleasure, right? Is expectations. And then you can have even added complications like faking orgasms or even withdrawing from non-sexual affection because, oh, I would like to hold your hand, but oh, if I hold your hand, maybe that means you're going to think I'm going to want to have sex and I don't want to give you that impression. So I won't even do these other things that I actually would like to do with you.
So we just see this withdrawal. Yeah, I just really want to echo what Lauren said, that we think of this as a relational dynamic, and we speak to this repeatedly, I think, in the book, right? That this is not one partner's problem. And I really want to emphasize that here with you and with your listeners, because what tends to happen, at least in my office, is that only one partner will show up for care, for sex therapy, right? And so we're starting to have this conversation of, well, this is a relational dynamic. This is actually a relational concern, not partner A or partner B. And we, speaking to cultural scripts, right, we so very much tend to treat the lower libido partner, the person who maybe is more responsive in their style of desire, they tend to be portrayed as the problem, kind of through our cultural narratives around sex. And so those tend to be the people that show up for sex therapy, relationship therapy, without their other partner. And there's only so much work that can be done without all parties involved in care, right? Because this is a relational concern, not an individual concern.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and I've had both. I think that's typically true in mainstream culture. I think in conservative culture, sometimes it's the high libido that comes in because it's like, well, you're too sexual. What's wrong with you? You're hypersexual, you're a sex addict, or those kinds of things. And so sometimes it's the higher libido partner who comes in and is like, I need to figure out how to tamper down my libido. And so what I really loved that is also throughout your book is you're saying, look, we all have a right to kind of how our libido shows up. And I think there's two things maybe, and you can address this. I think libido shows up kind of maybe naturally, like for all of us, we're kind of wired with certain different libidos. I think we know that some people are just born with higher libido than others. And then there's, of course, things that can interfere with libido or can heighten libido. Like if you're going through a bipolar manic episode, that might heighten your libido. Or if you're depressed and have clinical depression, that may lower your libido, or different medications you're taking or hormones. So there's so many things that can affect people's libidos, including trauma, that some people may not even know. I don't even know where my libido might be because I can't remember a time when I didn't have trauma in my life, right? Or even thinking about religious trauma or the messages we got as very young kids, that I don't know what my libido would be like if I hadn't received those messages. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, and sometimes we can never know. I often speak with patients in my office about kind of a statistical normal curve, and at the risk of getting a little too nerdy here, right? All human traits exist on kind of a normal curve or a bell curve, right? And so height is maybe the easiest example of this, right? There's really, really tall people, and then there's really, really short people. Most of us are somewhere in the average, right? Libido is a human characteristic, and so it's safe to kind of think about libido, spontaneous libido in particular, as existing on a normal curve, right? Some people are going to be really, really high. Some people are going to be really, really low. Most of us are somewhere floating around in the middle here. And certain, circumstances can change things, medication, illnesses, right? All the things you mentioned can kind of move us back and forth, but very rarely is it a dramatic jump from one end to the other.
What's interesting about libido too, that we have found, is that it doesn't go in one direction when you apply all these different variables. So it's not like when you apply more stress, everyone's libido lowers. It actually can go in either direction when you apply, all kinds of different variables, medications, relational challenges, other stressors. Some people feel an increase in desire and some people experience a lowering in desire. And so that's where it's also very contextual, it's dynamic, it's individual. And that's where it's a little bit different than maybe some other variables in life. that maybe tend to trend in a direction or another with certain, context. This is one that can go in either direction.
Yeah. And time, right? I mean, you may go through, I know that I was married for 26 years, and there were times when I was the higher libido partner in that marriage, and there was times when I was the lower libido partner in that marriage, just depending on pregnancies and age and hormonal shifts and changes. And, so you may take turns sometimes, but some couples, I think, especially if they're together long term, may notice a trend that they trend to be one or the other throughout their relationship. So that's normal too. I'd love for the two of you to talk about reasons why people have sex. This was kind of towards the beginning of the book, and I think it leads to some of these scripts that we're talking about and why people choose to have sex. And it's not just about, oh, I'm horny, or even just about, I'd like to connect with my partner.
Yeah. I would say before answering that, I think it's important to address why sex is not a drive, right? Because one leads to the next. So we often talk about sex drives in this culture. That's lingo that you hear all the time. I even hear it from my medical colleagues, and I'm like, that is not a thing, right? So drives are things that keep us alive. Hunger is a drive, thirst is a drive, fatigue is actually a drive, right? Because if we do not drink water, eat food, sleep for a very finite amount of time, we will die, right? Our bodies will not sustain life. Despite how some people might feel, not having sex, not having an orgasm for X amount of days has never killed a human being, right? Obviously, we need to have sex to kind of repopulate our species, but on an individual level, sex doesn't really work like a drive, right? This kind of gets to your question, Natasha. So when we think about what libido actually is, libido is what's known as an incentive motivation system, which is a really boring clinical way of saying we have to get something out of it. There needs to be an incentive that is worth pursuing in order to continue to desire to be sexual, right? What that is looks really different from person to person, right? These are the motivators that we talk about in the book early on. For a lot of people, motivators for sex are physical pleasure, right? Orgasms tend to feel good. Sexual experiences hopefully feel good. And so many people are motivated to be sexual with a partner because it feels good, physical motivators. For many others, it's an emotional connection. It's a spiritual experience, right? For some people, having an orgasm relieves cramps, right? Or it helps them sleep better. There are as many motivators for sex as there are humans out there in the world because it's different for all of us. And it's different between or within individuals, excuse me, over time.
There was a study in 2007 that found over 200 different motivators for being sexual. They fall into a few different themes, and kind of range. I think there were about like 7 to 9 different themes that they fall into. But all that to say that, again, we have so many different ways that we engage, and with 8+ billion, humans on the planet, it makes sense that there's a lot of different things that interest us, that we have, differences. And so one of the things that we encourage both in the book and with the clients that we work with is to give some thought to the motivators, because one of the things that can be really helpful in that is learning what it is that you're seeking out. And there may be a variety of ways to meet some of the underlying needs as to what brings you to reach out for a sexual experience. And what we found is when working with desire discrepancies, the more expansive that repertoire can be, where, if I'm really needing validation or comfort or affection or to feel wanted or desired, we might have a number of ways to get there. And the more ways there are to get there, or at least having more than one way to feel that, means that we can better address some of those relational needs underneath the surface, so that that's not to say they can't be met through sex some of the time, but maybe that sex is not the only pathway to get some of those relational needs met, because often there is a relational component to reaching out for relational sex. If it's just to get off, many of us can do that on our own. But when I reach out for a partner, it's usually because I'm looking for some sort of relational experience or interaction. So we like to encourage folks, and especially for folks with more responsive desire who tend to be the, quote unquote, lower desire partners, getting in touch with what their motivators are is also really helpful, because If the only motivator is relational, like I do this for my partner or to satisfy my partner, we might want to see what is there for you to experience in physical touch or an intimate dynamic so that you have a little bit more of your own incentive to show up and experience that for yourself as well.
Yeah, I think in the book you kind of state it straight up that if you're trying to increase sexual frequency only due to your partner's desires, that's typically probably not going to go well, and it enhances this anxiety feedback loop of pressure and I should, and then parts of your body are like, but this isn't fun, this isn't for me, right? And so
Right.
why would parts of my body want to put myself in that situation? I would say, like, my vagina doesn't know that I'm in love.
Right.
Knows that it's having fun or not, right? So
Right, exactly.
yeah.
The relational motivator is a good one, and it's a common one, and it's a fine one. We just find that it's troubling for most people, or it creates that same negative cycle if it's the only one that you have.
Right. Well, and I like this. I like to stick with this a little bit more because I do like how it can go both ways. I do get a lot of mixed orientation couples, and I think more recently, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when a couple came in and it was mixed orientation marriage, it was typically a gay man with a straight spouse or a lesbian woman with a straight man. But now I'm getting a lot more like, well, I think I'm asexual, and my partner's sexual, or I'm gray sexual, or I'm demisexual, and my partner is, allosexual, or those kinds of things. And I think this is a question that comes in is it healthy for me to just offer sex because I love this person and I want to stay in this relationship, but the sex isn't, like we're saying, really for me. And then on the other side of that, like you're saying, well, maybe even if I do get connection through sex, what are other ways I could connect with you that could still feel yummy, but we're not necessarily having to, impose that it has to be through, like, especially PIV sex, right? Penis and vagina, or, intercourse type sex. So yeah, so maybe we can talk a little bit about how this idea can help both sides of that. And are people selling themselves short if they're showing up for relational reasons only?
Yeah, and certainly I think it's worth saying right off the bat that ace folks and folks that are on the asexual spectrum, many of them are sexual in various ways. There's no kind of one size fits all for that. And absolutely, I see this certainly as well in my practice where folks who are in more of a mixed ace-allo relationship, the asexual person is feeling more motivated for that relational motivation, right? And as Lauren said, that tends to really become an issue when it's the only motivator. But it also really, I think, is such an individual basis, right? What I often hear from folks when that is their only motivator is that it feels like they're betraying themselves, right? So I'm only doing this for my partner. I'm having duty sex because I feel like I have to as a partner, as a spouse. And it feels like a betrayal to my own being, right? And that's when we really start to see resentment, hostility, kind of building up in relationships. If that person is not experiencing that, though, if they're saying, yeah, this is my relational motivator to be sexual with my partner, and it doesn't feel like a betrayal to my identity or my personhood, that's certainly a more sustainable approach to that motivator, right? And there's a lot of individual variability with that.
I'll also add that we come at the whole topic of sex in a more expansive way than most people think of sex or frame sex. So we think of it as sort of this umbrella, and usually use words like intimacy and intimate connection, physical touch, physical connection. So in the example of maybe one person who is a spectrum and one person's more allosexual, maybe the motivator for specific types of engagement, like penetrative sex or orgasms or genital contact, that might be a relational motivator. I do that because that really does something for my partner, and it may not be that inherently motivating for me. But there may be other things that we do that involve touch, pleasure, or connectedness that do speak to me, that I do enjoy just for myself. And then we incorporate that into our experiences as well, so that the entire experience as a whole is not one-sided to only one person's pleasure or one person's relational needs. So I think that's a nice way to sometimes balance some discrepancies in orientation or in sexuality is, you don't have to necessarily feel motivated for genital stimulation or orgasms, but maybe there's some way to feel touched or connected or affectionate or to experience pleasure together that does speak just for you. And let's make sure that we're giving you some time to experience that as well, so that you have your own piece in it.
I think I'm the person who brought up allosexual as a term, and I'm not sure everybody knows what that means. So I apologize.
Great point. Yeah, allosexual is just the term that folks have used to describe someone who is not asexual. So a lot of people have sexual attraction to others, and allosexual is just a term for that. So yeah, appreciate you bringing that up, Natasha.
I know sometimes I'm like, oh, I get in my nerdy sex therapy language, and then I'm like, oh yeah, not everybody knows what that means.
Yeah.
Well, what you're talking about right there goes right into another thing I wanted to discuss, which you talk about in the book, is like the staircase kind of model of sexuality versus the wheel model. So I'll let you all explain that. Those are models that different clinicians have come up with that you include here to talk about a little bit of what you're discussing as far as the diversity.
Yeah, so the staircase is something I started using early on in my career, gosh, probably over a decade or so ago now, to really in a visual representation, right? So I want your listeners to kind of visualize literally a staircase, right? So thinking about our dominant cultural narrative about what sex with partners are supposed to look like, quote unquote. And what that dominant cultural narrative really shows us is that sex with a partner tends to start with touching, what we might call colloquially foreplay, right? So touching, kissing, making out, right? The touching maybe moves to the genitals, maybe there's, hand stimulation, oral stimulation, and then things kind of culminate in usually penile vaginal penetration. And orgasm is at the very tip top of the staircase because at the end of the day, this cultural narrative is a cishet narrative, right? So cisgender heterosexual partnership, where the man's orgasm ends the sexual experience, right? I often will sort of joke with my patients, can you imagine if in a male-female relationship, if the woman had an orgasm and the man didn't and sex just ended, right? That would never happen in our culture because that's not how we think about sex. There would be riots on the street, I suspect, from these men. But that's how heterosexual cisgender sexual partnerships have been going on for years and years and years, where the end of the sexual experience is his orgasm, whether or not she has reached orgasm with him or also. And so this kind of visual of the sexual staircase, even if you're queer, if you're trans, if you're LGBTQ, that in many ways will not fit for you. And you've maybe already started to kind of deconstruct that internalized messaging because you kind of have to with your partnerships. But that messaging tends to be deeply internalized for a lot of us. And it creates a rigidity around partnered sex that can be hard to recognize until we really start thinking and talking about it. And it can be hard to get out of, right? To think more about the wheel model, which is more of a healthy, more adaptable, more flexible way of thinking. The staircase model can be harmful in so many ways because of its rigidity, right? This idea that one thing leads to another, and that the end all be all is penetrative intercourse. And everything else below that is just sort of like, well, yeah, it's fine if it's there, but it doesn't really matter because it's not the most important stuff. Lauren and I would certainly argue differently, and we do in the book.
Right. And I think, there's been a lot of emphasis that, especially if you're in a female body, the staircase model doesn't really lead to orgasm very effectively. Right. And so this is it. Dr. Lori Mintz, I think, maybe coined outer course. I'm not sure if she was the one that first coined that term versus intercourse. But it's this kind of idea that foreplay is no longer this, the term foreplay implies that it's before the real play, which is intercourse.
Right. She's certainly an advocate for, moving away from that language because it really downgrades anything that doesn't include typically what's at the top of the staircase, right? So we sort of relegate some of the things like kissing and touching, and we say that that's foreplay, that's outer course, but the real sex is intercourse and the real sex is the orgasms. And so within the staircase model, there's a hierarchy that's implied that says the stuff at the top is of value and the stuff at the bottom is just the stuff you do to get to the, higher value top.
And it ends up getting skipped anyway in long-term relationships, we find.
Right. It's the stuff that you just kind of move past or move over quickly to get to the real sex, right? Except what happens if some of the things that are getting skipped are some of your favorite things, or maybe even your favorite thing, or the very thing that you enjoy the most, right? And so if that's being portrayed as less than, or it doesn't count, or it's the only thing you do to kind of move quickly past it and go on to the other thing that matters more, that's really troubling to a lot of people. And when I talk to folks, doing sex therapy, there's some things that they're really missing out on that they used to do and they don't do anymore because that staircase kind of leaves them feeling like, okay, we're going to just hop, skip, and jump past it, or it doesn't count.
Yeah, I think this is so important. I'm sure you've heard, like, a lot of people will say, well, why can't we have sex like we did when we were first married or when we were first dating, if they had premarital sex and it was hot then. But then when you kind of ask them really specific questions about what was different, there was a lot more like foreplay and the kissing, the passionate making out and the taking the time. It wasn't just, wham bam, like, let's get down to business type of a thing. So.
Yeah, because I'm in a medical setting, I work with a lot of patients who are having pain with penetrative sex, pelvic pain, genital pain, sexual pain of some kind. That's very, very common in my practice. And I'm often talking about the staircase and sort of this trap of in long-term relationships, we don't even do the bottom steps. We tend to truncate the staircase and just skip up to the top, like Lauren was saying, right to intercourse. And then maybe one partner has an orgasm, but the other one doesn't. That is a huge risk factor for pain with penetration, right? Because we're not actually having good arousal, we're not slowing down. It's also a huge risk factor for really continuing to damage libido over time, especially for somebody who's more responsive in their style of libido, because they haven't really had the physical arousal happening before we're already just having penetration. And then, of course, orgasm is very unlikely in that scenario too, right? So harming sexual experience all around when we truncate the staircase like that. And that tends to happen in long-term relationships. It's pretty common.
Yeah, right. No, I really appreciate you mentioning that. That's so important. So, okay, with the time we have left, let's maybe dive into, so what are folks to do? What are some things? I mean, and we're never going to get to everything. That's why everybody has to get the book, because it's full. It really is. You've done a wonderful job of really filling it with so many different suggestions and evidence-based practice, everything from sensate focus to communication and to Gottman styles. I mean, you just really included so many wonderful things. But what would you say are maybe a few things that you'd like to put out there in this interview that would help a couple maybe have some of these conversations or find ways to bridge the libido gap, as we might call it?
Well, since I was already on the topic of sexual pain, right, I'll say that for most people, unwanted sexual pain does not help libido, as you might imagine, right? And it's a normal reaction to not want to do something that hurts you. And so if you are one of very, very many people that experience sexual pain, unfortunately, that's quite common in our culture. There is help available. Please do not push through sexual pain, right? If something is hurting and you're not wanting it to hurt, we need to stop immediately. And we need to consult a physician of some kind, preferably somebody who's trained in sexual medicine. That might be a gynecologist, it might be an internal medicine provider. And also consider consulting with a pelvic floor physical therapist in your area. If there's pain with sex, unwanted pain with sex, pain with penetration in particular, we need to really have a good medical workup and figure out what's going on, because libido is not going to go anywhere if that's how your sexual experiences are feeling.
Right, right. Lauren, what would you add?
A couple of things. One is, again, highlighting that this is usually a dynamic between two or more people. And so I like to remind folks that this is something that we work on ideally together as partners to address, rather than, what tends to be pretty unhelpful is sort of seeing one person as the problem and then sending them off to go, quote unquote, get fixed and work on it yourself, figure it out, and come back to me when everything's, better or different. Tends to be a really unhelpful framework for working on and addressing this concern. So as much as we can, coming in together, talking about it together, working on it together, because it does tend to have a dynamic, and there do tend to be sort of roles and patterns that we see that come alongside this. For the partner who has more responsive desire, tends to be maybe the lower desire partner of the dynamic. Kind of going back to what brings you pleasure and what's your own motivator or incentive to be sexual. And are there things that you might enjoy or like just for yourself? And something that you were talking about, Natasha, is sort of that all or none that comes up with like, well, maybe we would make out, but then maybe making out leaves my partner, feeling or thinking that we're going to move up the staircase and we're going to be more sexual. And so because of that, I may hesitate to do the very thing that I might enjoy. So we really encourage deconstructing the staircase, getting off the staircase, creating a more open-ended experience. And so having pleasurable experiences that focus on pleasure rather than focus on trying to achieve goals or go through a certain linear progression of acts or behaviors. So for the lower desire person, especially, like really working on what's this just for you? What does this look like? What's in it for you? What do you enjoy? Can you explore that? Can we give you some room to identify that and then advocate for that? As long as your partner is willing to, give some room to give you space for that and participate. And then for the higher desire partners, we're often looking at ways to kind of bid for connection in more expansive ways as well, right? So rather than saying like, do you want to have sex? And this is like the only way I connect with you or the only way I feel loved, or can we have different ways of asking for what those underlying needs are, getting clear on what that is. I need some reassurance. I'd really love just some like non-demand touch, no like expectation. Can I just lie here with you? Can you hold me? Are some of these things that you can ask for so that things don't feel so all or none or so inflexible.
Yeah, that's really good. And like you even talk a little bit about like the art of compromise. How do you have these conversations? So often because we're hurt or we're defensive, we're saying things that are just not helping the situation, right? Like instead of, oh, thank you for being honest with me, or, thank you for, or I'm not willing to necessarily have sex, but I'd love to cuddle, and just connect with you that way. Like, we're like, no, I don't want to, or why would you think I'd want to? Or, well, that's really shitty that you said that. Or, so we get really grumpy with each other, and which just adds to this super huge pain points that people are really in pain about, and not having a lot of skills on knowing how to have those conversations together. So I really appreciate you bringing all that up. And you have some really great scripts and models of different types of ways that people can talk to each other. So I really encourage people to look at that chapter for sure. Just to wrap things up, as far as I'm concerned, and then I'm going to ask you if I'm not asking something that you want to talk about, but you talk a little bit about, okay, so there are things that we are sexually maybe incompatible about. I think one of the things you mentioned is like a couple where one person's interested in kink and one isn't, or one person's, who knows, whatever it is. And you give like 5 different possibilities. And I think these were all really good to just kind of think through. Do you want to share them, or do you want me to share them? Because I have them in front of me. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'll probably remember most, but not all of them.
Okay. I know I write things. And people ask me what I write, and I'm like, I wrote that? No.
It was a while ago.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, it's often things like, we do something that leans more in one partner's direction. We do some things that lean more in another partner's direction. When it comes to sexual discrepancies, we have a couple of other options at our disposal as well. Some people choose to open up their relationships so that they can have expansive experiences without placing that expectation on their partner to fulfill. Some people decide to just meet their own sexual needs through fantasy, masturbation, solo sex, and that can be a way of exploring some of their interests. Some people decide the relationship is not going to work out, that is, it is an option. It does happen. I always like to tell people that that is not the norm in terms of the experience I have in my work, that more often than not, there are gray areas and there are ways to be flexible and to make things work. But, you know, a real incompatibility, which I don't see as often, but does happen, is when people are really more on like complete opposite ends of a spectrum, and there's just not a great way to meet in the middle.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say, anecdotally speaking, probably my mixed orientation marriages are the ones that have the highest divorce rate, specifically because oftentimes the reasons why they married to begin with were religious, and maybe that shifted over time and they don't have those same values anymore. But I loved how you both talked about this. You said, well, you can continue to try to change the other person. And
Doesn't tend to go well.
doesn't tend to go well, right? Which is kind of
But
where
you can
people
try.
But we do that sometimes.
Mhm.
Is that why we all end up in marital counseling or relational counseling? Is because we're trying to change the other person. So the second option is like kind of like you were saying, Lauren, working together, trying to see where can we find negotiations, where can we kind of meet in the middle. Radically accepting was another one. So it's like, well, we just accept those. This is kind of how you come wired. This is how I come wired. These are our preferences, our templates. We're just going to have to accept it. Where I think some of that solo sexuality can also show up. Then you said, yeah, opening up the relationship, which that's becoming a little bit more mainstream. I think a few more people are interested in exploring that. And I've had people who try it and then go back to monogamy, and people who try it and who love it. And there's all different kinds of spaces for that. And then, of course, like you're saying, ending the relationship. And I do tell people, sexuality is a big enough deal that it is a valid reason. It's hopefully it's not the only reason you're ending a relationship, but it is a valid reason to end a relationship, which again, I don't think, especially those of us from religious communities, ever got that message. It's like, that's not a reason, right? You should stay sexually miserable and stay together no matter what.
Yeah.
Right. Just because the staying married piece is so much more prioritized than people's pleasure or long-term satisfaction in a relationship.
And we acknowledge in the book that that option is a scary option. It's certainly not the first option that we would lean people towards, but it is an option. And out of those 5, it's important to still put it on the table because it might be the last choice option, but it is one.
Right.
And sometimes that is the necessary option, despite not wanting that to be true.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing about sexuality is that for some people, it is a really significant part of their lives. And for others, it's a really insignificant part of their lives. And there is no right or wrong to that, too. So if sex is really significant, a really strong part of your identity and who you are, if you feel like it's really integrated and woven into your day-to-day life, then you may be one of the folks who, finds it harder to compromise or negotiate, or really has a strong need for it to look a certain way. And to your point, Natasha, that's okay. We're not going to mandate that of other people and, push that agenda on other people to hold it in the same place that we do, but to know that and to be able to state that, and then find places where we can experience that.
And I have loved having those conversations with couples where they can really lower their defensiveness and really sit in that space of like, I'm not going to shame you or blame you for being different than me. I'm going to accept that you're different than me. And then from there, we can have a really robust conversation about what we want to do about that. And so that's where people usually come in pretty defensive and blamey and upset. And why aren't you more like me? Right. That's why can't you show up like I show up? So, okay. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you were like really hoping to cover or maybe final thoughts before we end as far as questions or topics that you'd like to discuss?
You've been so thorough. Thank you. I mean, again, we always tend to end with reminding listeners that desire differences are the norm and not the exception. So that part.
Yes, agreed. Lauren, what about you?
And just highlighting the flexibility that's so key in having long-term satisfying sexual experiences. Because even if you find something that works now for everyone involved, things can change. We get older, our circumstances change, our stressors change, our bodies change. So having some flexibility and sort of a growth mindset around sexual experience is really helpful for having, thriving, satisfying sexuality through a lifespan.
I love it. All right, everybody. We've been talking about the book Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. I think this is, although there are quite a few books about low desire in particular, I don't know that there's as many that are as relational as I've seen this book be, and that also include, chapters specifically for high libido folks. And I've been talking to Jennifer Vencill and to Dr. Lauren Fogel Mersy, and I'm so glad that you spent this time with us. So we really appreciate it. And we know your time is valuable, and we really appreciate your energy and educating all of us through this great resource. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
You.
All right. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland.